You're here with Eliza Spang, Director of Learning Design at the Woodrow Wilson Academy, and you'll be hearing insights from the front lines on testing and assessment. Eliza, talk about your teaching experience. Where'd you teach? What grade? What subject? How many years?
Hi, I'm Eliza Spang, Director of Learning Design. I taught in Massachusetts and California, both high school level, 9th and 10th grade. Subjects in Massachusetts were environmental science and biology, and when I moved to California, I taught biology and integrated science at the 9th and 10th grade levels. Integrated science then was a combination of teaching biochem, physics, and earth science using themes as the connecting tissue of integrating all of those subjects. And for how many years? I taught for 5 years.
And what role did assessment play in your classrooms?
Assessment was key in my classroom. It enabled me to see what my students understood and could do and what they were not understanding and what they were struggling with. I used assessment in many ways that you all are probably used to as students. In one way, I used it to check for understanding throughout the course of a lesson, and in other ways, I used it as a summative assessment to test bigger understandings and bigger demonstration of skills that were not necessarily seen within one lesson.
And did your teacher training program prepare you to take on these various assessment responsibilities, or did you end up learning on the job?
I did learn some about assessment, my teacher training, but most of my learning happened on the job, especially in the high school where I worked in California. My science department was very collaborative. We team taught all courses, so there were at least 2 teachers teaching the same course at the same time. So we co-designed not only the learning experiences, but also the assessments. And one of the core features of the science department where I taught was that we did a lot focused on hands-on assessment. So testing by having students use knowledge and skills they gained from labs in a lab-focused assessment.
And can you talk about the most creative and successful assessment you ever implemented?
I can talk about 2 different creative and successful assessments. One type of assessment that we used quite a bit in the integrated science program was basically a lab-based assessment that included several different stations around the classroom where students would sit and engage in an actual learning experience using equipment and materials to answer interesting questions that gauge their understanding of a particular concept or skill. So rather than a multiple choice test or an essay test, the students had to do something in order to answer. It tested their ability to do and demonstrate their knowledge and skills. The other really creative and successful assessment was in the biology class at the California high school, where we did a field study. It was an 8-week project where students investigated very deeply a particular area that they chose in nature near their house or near the school, where they collected lots of data over 8 weeks and observed every day to see what changes happened in that particular ecosystem. And they developed their own questions they were interested in asking and collected the data to answer those questions.
Okay, and what were the results, and how did you end up using them?
For the more lab-based assessments in the integrated science class, we would look at those summative assessments and really see where the strengths were in what the students learned and use those to build on in the next units of learning that we were planning to do. And we also identified gaps in understanding, so we knew what needed to be revisited in the next unit. We also figured out what worked and what didn't work in the assessment. Sometimes the station we set up didn't have all of the right equipment that we thought needed to be there, or the question was phrased in a way that was confusing. So the assessment not only helped us figure out what the students knew how to do in terms of demonstrating their knowledge and skills, but it also allowed us to figure out what was working and what wasn't working with a particular summative assessment. With the field study project, that was over a longer period of time. So that was really interesting because we could collect information about how the students were progressing over the course of that big project-based assessment and see where they needed support throughout the project, not just at the end. So there was scaffolding in the assessment that allowed them to submit different parts of the project at different points to get feedback, so they knew where they stood and what they needed to do, and we also knew where they were in terms of their accomplishment of the projects.
Okay, so that's about improving a good test, but how about some testing catastrophes? Did you ever give an assessment that didn't go as expected?
Yes, definitely. We did use some multiple choice tests and essay tests for our biology course, and we definitely had times where the results came back, and because the class was team taught, I could look at not only comparing the biology classes that I taught, but I could compare them with how the classes that my colleague taught, how they were doing as well, which was really interesting because sometimes we would be able to identify learning gaps that my students had that my colleague students did not have, which indicated to me that I had not taught something well or I didn't make it accessible or engaging for my students. And then also in terms of multiple choice tests, there were times when the questions were not clear to the students or there was something that happened with the answer key that was not correct. And so the students were really fast to figure out what wasn't fair with the test and would quickly raise those issues when we would talk through what they thought wasn't fair, what was fair to figure that out. Anytime there was a testing catastrophe or a testing issue, my colleague and I would always have a conversation to figure out how we could remedy it. So that might mean reteaching, it might mean retesting, it might be figuring out how to rescore the test that would make it fairer for the students themselves who engaged in it.
But any advice for first-time teachers who will be playing a key role, not just teaching, but assessing learning?
Yeah, I think one thing to think about with assessments is be ready for your assessments to not necessarily go as planned, as you need to be ready for your lessons to not go necessarily as planned. You might think you have the perfect assessment, but the wording of a question or a quick mistake with an answer key or just the design of a particular assessment might not work. And so you can recover. It's okay. Mistakes happen. And part of teaching is figuring out what didn't work and what worked really well and really taking what works really well and continuing to build on that to create really effective assessments. And also keeping in mind that assessments are really the key to figuring out what is in your students' heads and how they're thinking about what they are learning, and to use assessments in different ways in terms of using them as summative assessments to figure out what learning goals have they reached over a longer period of time, as well as smaller formative assessments or just even questioning during class to figure out where students are on their pathways to reaching your bigger learning goals.